of Umran Daknish on an ambulance in Aleppo, to the boys and girls living in the freezing cold of muddy tents in the Halol camp in northeastern Syria, have become a tragic hallmark of the Syrian conflict and a powerful and haunting reminder of our collective failure to act. Exactly 10 years later, the 9th annual report on violations against children in Syria, released by the Syrian Network for Human Rights, tells us, or rather screams, that across Syria, children continue to be tortured, killed, maimed, arbitrarily detained, forcibly displaced, and deprived of the most basic rights to health, education, and to a safe home, on a scale that should shock the conscience of mankind, and that instead seems to go increasingly and tragically unnoticed. To discuss the findings of the report and the devastating impact of the conflict on children in Syria, today panels brings together Syria experts and analysts, as well as human rights and child rights practitioners, all of whom have focused extensively on the plight of child rights violations in Syria. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Martin Lieser, First Secretary with the Syria team at the German Embassy in Beirut, Dr. Troels Engel, Senior Stabilization Advisor on Syria to the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, based in Istanbul, Ms. Paola Sastrovigiotto, Deputy Syria Envoy and Political Advisor to the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, based in Beirut, Mr. Fadel Abdulghani, Chairman of the Syrian Network for Human Rights, who brought us all here today. Ms. Lina Biskaya, Senior Legal Officer with the United Nations Investigative Mechanism for Accountability of Daesh/ISIL. Mr. Javier Perez Salmeron, a member of the Child Rights Expert Roster of Justice Rapid Response and the former Child Rights Advisor to the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria. And last but not least, we are very pleased to have with us Professor Diane Maria Mann, Professor of International Law and Faculty Co-Director of the Dean Rusk International Law Center at the University of Georgia School of Law, and Special Advisor to the International Criminal Court Prosecutor on Children in and affected by armed conflict. So as you can see, a truly long list of distinguished speakers. I will now give the floor to the representatives of Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands for a few introductory remarks, with many thanks again to all of you for being with us today. We will start with the representative of Germany. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Valentina. Dear Fadel, dear colleagues and friends of the Syrian Network for Human Rights, and friends of the Syrian people. I am very pleased to see that so many of you have tuned in today for what I'm sure will be a very fruitful discussion of a topic that, of course, in a more humane and more just world should never exist. The unfathomable suffering of children as a result of war, of repression, of the cynical machinations of the regime and of other national and international parties to the conflict. And yes, of the failure of the international community as well to put an end to that conflict as we approach the 10th anniversary of its outbreak. I want to thank you, Fadel, and the entire SNHR team on behalf of the German government for your kind invitation to co-host today's launch of the 9th annual report on violations against children in Syria. And I'm grateful to share this opportunity with my colleagues from the Netherlands and from Denmark. SNHR to us has been a long-standing partner, a much cherished source of insights that inform our own reporting and that feed into our policymaking process. And therefore, we did not hesitate a second when we were offered and asked to sponsor today's launch. So thank you very much. I would like to extend this expression of our gratitude and appreciation to all those amongst you who work for and who care for the alleviating of the suffering of children inside Syria, and also of those children who had to flee their country or who were born abroad to families that left Syria to seek a refuge abroad. SNHR conducts most valuable research and documentation that also serves as a basis for accountability and for transitional justice, which is key to overcoming conflict and building sustainable peace. The German and also the EU position in this regard are very well established. All perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity must be held accountable. And as we've said it many times, promoting accountability and justice and combating impunity remains a high priority and a fundamental part of any future process of national reconciliation in Syria. We have also made this clear on many occasions during our tenure as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council from 2018 to 2020. Please allow me to just briefly add some personal remarks. It's perhaps a bit of a cliche, but as diplomats, we are supposed to and expected to be, eloquent, to strike the right chord, to find the appropriate words, whatever the situation might be. That's the theory, right? But then when reading reports such as the one to be presented today, I, speaking for myself personally here, have to say that words regularly fail me. 29,375 children killed, 4,956 children detained or forcibly disappeared, 179 children tortured to death. And I think it's all too easy and maybe even tempting to reduce the suffering of these children to mere, data points, to aggregates, to abstractions, way beyond our imagination, yet all too real. For behind each individual case, of course, stands a young life destroyed. Speaking here for a major donor country, I therefore want to make one point very clear, and that is that Syria and the plight of its children have not been forgotten, that we are not indifferent. For indifference is always the friend of the aggressor, never of his victim, whose pain is magnified when he or she feels forgotten. The prisoner in his cell, the hungry children, the homeless refugees, not to respond to their plight, not to relieve their solitude by offering them a spark of hope, is to exile them from human memory. And in denying their humanity, we betray our own. These were not my words, these were words of Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Peace Laureate of 1986, who as a young child had suffered at the hands of the Nazi regime in the country that I represent today. Today, we are not indifferent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. I would now like to give the floor to Dr. Troels Enkel from Denmark. Over to you, Troels. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Valentina, and to Martin for those strong words, which I will somewhat echo. Dear Fadel, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation to speak today. It's really a pleasure to be in such good company. I should clarify from the beginning that I speak as an advisor to the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This means that I do not formally represent Denmark or our policy, but that I can speak from my position where I monitor and implement our peace and stabilization program in Syria. And the Syrian Network for Human Rights is a partner in our peace and stabilization program. We're very proud to have a close and strategic partnership with SNHR, because the work that SNHR does is crucial for shedding light on human rights violations in Syria, no matter who the perpetrator was. It's because of SNHR that we have much of the information from inside Syria that we have. Because of SNHR and other organizations, no one can say that we do not know what is happening in Syria. That it is clear that the situation is a human rights crisis and a man-made disaster. I rely on facts and figures from SNHR in much of my work to track civilian casualties, to track detention and torture, and to be reminded of how human rights violations impact different groups. Now SNHR has produced its 9th report, 9th on the rights of Syrian children. And again, we are reminded of the unacceptable situation. Children are regularly killed as a result of military action. They are arbitrarily detained or even forcefully conscripted. Children have been tortured. And I would add that depriving children of access to education, to clean water and healthy food, to a safe home, that all this hits children particularly hard. Growing up in the Syrian conflict marks generations for life and probably only makes it harder to bring about a stable future for Syria. I've spent the previous many years following the Syrian and other conflicts where human rights violations have been rampant and where children have suffered from the actions of grown-ups. It's easy to become cynical, to reduce violations to statistics, and to forget that there are actual individual people behind each number in reports like those from SNHR. 29,406 is the number I found in the report of children killed since March 2011 in Syria. 2,900 and 429,000. Sorry, it's too big to me to even read. 29,406. Imagine that. As I'm father myself to a baby girl, I find myself taking a new look at these statistics and remembering the fate of these human beings and their parents who loved them. The Lost Hope is the title of this event, but I refuse to lose hope. There's too much at stake. First and foremost, the future of the children themselves. And the future of Syria and the stability of the region also depend on the future of the children. So it's imperative that people continue to assist the children in need, that they continue to work to deter further violations against children, and that they continue to work so that one day it will be possible to hold accountable those who violate the rights of children. My fellow panelists today and their organizations are at the forefront of this work, and I commend them for that. And they are the real experts today. So I will end my remarks here and cede my time to hear from them. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your interest in the rights of Syrian children.
Thank you very much, Troels. And I will now give the floor to Ms. Paula Sastrowijato from the Netherlands. Over to you, Paula.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Valentina, and good afternoon all, dear Fadel, dear panelists, dear colleagues from Beirut and Istanbul. I'm very happy to be here today as a co-sponsor to this meeting. It's an important report. It's the 9th already, and I wish that wasn't the case, because 9 is not a nice figure. I mean, it's been too long. As you know, probably accountability is one of the priorities of the Dutch foreign policy and human rights policy. And the Netherlands has been working for years to combat impunity. Gross violations, including torture by the regime, cannot go unpunished. We need to establish justice for victims, all the victims, and children above all. Over the years, we've been supporting NGOs and the IIIM in the field of documentation, but we felt that was not enough at the time. So that's why we've decided in September of last year to hold Syria to account under the international law for gross violations of human rights and torture in particular. We started that procedure in September by informing the Syrian government of this decision, but I cannot reveal at the moment where we are at this particular moment, except for that we are reviewing documentation on violations that we receive from different NGOs we work with. You will be, of course, duly informed if and when this case is going to the Court of Justice. That might still take a while. The report of today shows the severity of the situation. And we see a regime that will not stop at anything to bomb its people, to kill its children. The numbers are staggering. And the report shows 29,000 and more that are being deprived of a normal livelihood, education, and just the right to have a normal life. So my appeal is to other nations, actually, today, to hold Syria to account under the conventions of the right of the child. I'm happy that we have so many legal experts here today. Maybe they can enlighten us a little bit more on how they see the possibilities under this particular convention. We're happy to share our experiences with other states that wish to do so. And like Truls, I would say, let's not lose hope for Syria. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paula. And really many thanks, Martin, Truls, and Paula. And many thanks again to Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands for sponsoring this event and for your country's continued efforts to support the cause of justice and accountability in Syria. I'm now very pleased to open our panel discussion, and our first speaker today is Fadel Abdul Ghani, who needs no introduction. Fadel, you and your team have been tirelessly documenting human rights violations in Syria since June 2011, so since the very early stages of the conflict, and you've been releasing a thematic annual report on violations against children since. As the 10th anniversary of the conflict approaches, the title you have suggested for this side event is "The Lost Hope," as Truls was also highlighting. Is that your main takeaway from this report, based on the trends and patterns that you have identified?
I hope not. I hope not. I would like to start with thanking again to Germany, Denmark, and Netherlands for sponsoring this event and their support to our work, as well as their interest in advocating human rights in Syria. Thank you, dear friend Valentina, to help in organizing this event. We have been friends for years, since the early days of your leading the investigators team in the International Commission of Inquiry. Also, we extended our appreciation to our dear colleagues who agreed to participate and speak on a critical issue. Answering to your question, let me highlight my remarks in focusing on three main aspects. Then let's decide it based on that. Now, I'm coming from the heart of a crucial conflict. So my main three aspects is, the first one is that children have been subjected to almost every violation. The second one is the amount of violations and its continuity on this scale for 10 years warns of a disaster for the future of Syria. The third one is the threatened future and the lost hope. So let's talk about all of that, and then let's conclude what's based on the facts and the figures. So the first aspect is that the things is, since the start of 10 years ago, SNHR has monitored and documented the violation committed in Syria, and our works on documenting different types of violation. In the beginning, the focus was on killings, arbitrary arrest, enforced disappearance, torture, sexual assault, mainly by, and all of those mainly committed by Assad regime. But later, that expanded to include other kinds, such as arbitrary bombings, siege, displacement, destruction, looting of properties, and other violation, as many as other parties took part in Syria conflict other than the Syrian regime. I want to shed light on the children in Syria, as they have suffered all kinds of violation at the hand of all parties, and these violations were widespread, some of which targeted children because they are, with no care or consideration. We at SNHR attack a pivotal importance to documenting crimes perpetrated against children on our database and referring in particular to these in all reports, statements, and news items we issued. We also issued dedicated reports and news on crimes against children with part of the database specially reserved for categorizing violation against children of Syria by all parties to conflict since 2011 to date, which includes all violations we have been able to document. On the occasions of the World Children's Day every year, we issued an extensive report that include the most notable violation against children of Syria during the past year, since the World Children's Day in the previous year up to the same date in the present year, focusing particularly on the border more harmful violations such as extrajudicial killing, arbitrary arrest, detention, torture, sexual violence, forced conscription, displacement, and deprivation of education. These reports do not address the profound physiological trauma suffered by children as a result of violation perpetrated against them and its effect on their lives. This issue, I think, it's need a specific report, and there is other types of violation need to be highlighted, such as forced marriage of minors, forced labor and exploitation of children in violation of the worst form of child labor convention. The report is based on our database archive, which has grown steadily since March 2011 through daily monitoring and documenting of violations in accordance to our methodology and with all information and details that we have been able to access and verify. I would like to point out that SNHR continuously cooperated with the UNICEF. SNHR cooperated with monitoring and reporting mechanism in Syria through a constant monthly sharing of SNHR data, which our team has been able to document, showing multiple types of violation against children, such as killing, maiming of violation of children, recruitment, conscription, kidnapping, arrest, detention, attack on schools, hospitals, health or education, personal sexual violence, and denial of humanitarian access to children. So the second aspect is the scale of violation in Syria and why Syria is exceptional and extraordinary. Based on the report that the statistics mentioned are not a result of 1 year of violations, but rather an accumulative tool of decades since 2011. These statistics, as I mentioned before, are not what we managed to document and not an estimation. It's according to our database, and I'm assured hereby that these statistics are the minimum limit. And we are confident that there have been many violations that haven't reached us, and therefore we were unable to document and follow up on due to logistic, financial, and security challenges. Violation against children in Syria have been enormous, and given that many and varied pattern in their severity impact. We at SNHR focus particularly on categories of serious, grave, life-threatening violations that have been identified by the United Nations Security Council. So extrajudicial killing coming at the top, which we are keep following that, and the total figure is actually about 30,000, and this figure constitutes approximately 8% of all civilians casualties, which is very high percentage comparing to any other conflict. Here we can notice that the Syrian regime is killed about 23,000 and the Russian forces about 2,000. That means 25,000 from 30,000. And always the percentage of the Syrian regime and his allies is approximately 85% from the total violations. Moving to arbitrary arrest and enforced disappearance, here we can notify and emphasize that the vast majorities of arbitrary arrest amount to enforced disappearance in Syria. And that we can maybe extend it if we have time at the discussion part. Here we can notice that also the Syrian regime from amount approximately 5,000 cases, the Syrian regime is responsible for 3,609 cases. ISIS about 319 children. We don't know anything about their fate till this moment. So anything related to ISIS, children or even men or women is actually in vain. We don't know anything about them. Victims who died due to torture, and this figures is also awful. And here I want to emphasize that, as I mentioned at the beginning, that the treatment of the children have been committed similar to treatment of the adults. So that from those and the arrested or disappeared children, approximately 178 cases which we are able to document being killed due to torture, and Assad regime responsible for 173 cases. Moving to sexual violence, also we documented several cases of the sexual violence committed by Assad regime inside the center detention and outside the center detention, and we have about 539 incidents of sexual violence against children. Deprivation of education and child labor. Here we linked this to the bombardment of the schools and the kindergartens, which we are following. We documented in approximately 10 years at least 1,189 schools and 29 kindergartens being affected and bombardment by Assad regime and the Russian forces and other parties as well. Russian forces responsible for at least 220 schools. Hayat Tahrir Sham responsible for attacks 3 schools, and also SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, the PYD, at least responsible for 10 schools. So comparing those figures, we can see the scale. Scale is important. That then when we describe the widespread and the systematic of this violation, Assad and his allies, the Iranian and his militia, is responsible for 1,189 attacks against the school. Russia is 220, and then the remaining parties. Moving to the conscription, also here all parties is engaged in conscription as well, by by Assad regime and the National Defense Forces, Assad militia. Here we can notice that the extremist group emulating ISIS strategy in children conscription. HTS, also Hayat Tahrir Sham, established also training camps for children, enrolling them in sharing courses, an effort to influence their beliefs and direct them to take up arms and fight, and putting them on front line. Here, SNHR, what we did actually, we're following who's died from those conscripted children, so that we can know and give us an indicators. Here, hereby, I can refer to several cases that we find out that this children is died at the front line, and he's a conscripted child. Moving to other parties, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and I'm moving, sorry for that, very quickly, due that the report is in your hand. SDF also conscripted children in a widespread manner, seeking to recruit children in all area under their control, either by encouraging them to join the forces and offering or by offering instrument or through kidnapping, targeting children while they were at school or at street or neighborhoods. So they arrest the children or kidnapped and then force them to follow their to follow in the battlefield. The Kurdish self-management signed a joint action plan with the UN in June 2019 to end the recruitment, but unfortunately, till this moment, we're still noticing that they are arresting children and recruit them. The report from the United Nations Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict for the year 2019, issued in June 2020, confirmed that SDF were the worst perpetrator among the parties of the conflict in regard to the child recruitment. That when we compare how much these parties recruit comparing with the other parties, so we have this conclusion based on the United Nations Secretary General report. Our team has documented at least 113 cases of child conscription carried out by SDF since their establishment. Approximately 29 of these conscripted children subsequently killed in the battlefield. Armed opposition factions, or the National Army now, same name, have exploited the poor living condition to children. They are living under their control area, including the loss of their families' breadwinner to conscript the children into their forces. We have documented the death of 5 children while participating with armed opposition factions in fighting on their battlefield. Moving to the IDP's children, nearly 1 million children still living in the camps spread across Syria, which is they are suffering from worst living conditions and lack the most basic element, privacy, housing, medical health care, along with a total absence of safety measures. Finally, I would like to highlight a very sensitive issues which be rare to be focused on, which is the remnants of the weapons, particularly cluster munitions, which have been used exclusively by the Syrian regime and the Russian forces. We documented that the use of the cluster munitions, with approximately 427 children killed from the remains of the cluster munition, and as you know, approximately between 10 to 40% of the remaining of this type of weapons remaining unexploded. So that mainly affect the children, and more specifically the IDP children. The second one is the landmine. Landmine actually planted by all parties, because landmine is a cheap weapons, and it's coming as a second threat after cluster munitions, and one again, the ITPs is the most vulnerable because they displaced in agriculture area, so that will affect Syria future and children for decades. In 2020, we have our annual report, hopefully will publish next week, but we've been published our annual report about the casualties and extrajudicial killing. Let me highlight to you, let me emphasize that 2020 is there is a noticeable drop in the average of bombing and violence, mainly because of COVID-19. And this is a short, let me give you a short presentation on the most notable violation against children. So extrajudicial killing, we documented 326 children killed in 2020, 52 cases of arbitrary detention, 62 attacks against education facilities, school and kindergartens. Those figures comparing with the previous years is at the bottom line. But I'm ensuring that despite this step drop compare with the previous year, those figures are still the highest in the world. I don't know, maybe I take much from the time, so I can maybe shift a bit from my presentation to the discussion and also the conclusion. I don't know how much time I still have. Valentina is sending me direct message to wrap up. I'll do that. She is now the boss, so she has all the authority. So based on those figures, I think that there is a real or a serious threat to the future, and that's moved me to the last aspect. The things is that the impact is not only against the children victims themselves, but that also being affected their friends as well. So that actually affected millions of Syrian children, and we need to bear in our mind that lots of those children in previous year moved to be adult men and women, and they carried in their mentality what they suffered through their childhood. So the blockage of the horizon and loss of hope, homelessness, and the loss of father and families, all of this build a fertile environment for the ideological and sexual attraction and exploitation of children by many parties, especially the Iranian militia. And we're noticing that Iranian is doing a great job in recruiting children based on spreading their ideology, the pro-Syrian regime militia, and we also the extremist group, the extremist organization. Although there are many, so based on that, if the reaction continue like this, those children, I think that they lost the hope, and based on that, we can notice that lots of children move to the extremist organization, and that is our main responsibility by highlighting such an alarm and such a report. Thank you very much for listening, and maybe if there is time for discussion and for conclusion by end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fadel, and I also hope there will be time to elaborate more on these harrowing figures during the Q&A session. Thanks again. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Lina Biskaya. Lina, you've been working literally day and night on the Syrian conflict as an analyst and chief analyst with different UN bodies since 2016. What role have violations against children played in the overall military strategy and modus operandi of the parties to the conflict, and how to situate these violations in the overall trajectory of the Syrian conflict over the past 10 years?
Yes, first, hello everyone. I'll skip the morning, afternoon, because I really don't know where the participants are. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Syria does have a very special place in my heart. It's been very hard to distance myself from the events, so I'm very happy to be here. When Valentina invited me to participate, I told her, couldn't you think of easier questions to ask me? And I was kind of struggling, how was I gonna answer these two questions, the role of grave violations in the broader strategy of the warring parties, and the second part, what is their role in the trajectory of the conflict? And I've concluded that perhaps a concise way to go about it is to start with these remarks. Those violations have changed across time, and they mostly have changed as the conflict has evolved. So depending on the time at which they took place, depending on the perpetrator, and depending on the gender of the victims, we will see variations in the last 10 years. So what I'm going to try to do is to split, to try to analyze these patterns in three chunks of information. First is 2011 to 2012, and that would mark the beginning of the demonstrations up to the point that not only the unrest evolved to an armed conflict, but also that the Syrian government started using air power. The second part would focus more on 2013 to 2016, which was largely marked by the use of sieges, and that was by both armed groups and the Syrian government, although the majority were by the Syrian government. And then from 2017 onwards, when most of the sieges were over and almost all of the population that used to live under areas controlled by the opposition has now moved to the province of Idlib. So as Valentina noticed, I knew that I was not going to be original in bringing up the Dara boys who were arrested before, almost a month before what we now consider the anniversary of the Syrian revolution, which is the 15th of March. They were arrested in February. So there were 15 of them, aged 10 to 15 years old. They were detained and they were tortured. And in fact, this would become a pattern for the first 2 years, 2011, 2012, for boys at least. So what we have, as you all know, what we have in 2011 is demonstrations that start as peaceful. And at the protests, even when we looked at the videos, we could see that the vast majority of those attending were males. There were women there too. There were teenagers, but there were also adults who were taking their infant children to the protests. So what happened was that once the Syrian government forces started the crackdown on the protests, whether with snipers, whether by beating protesters, whether by being arrested, we didn't see a differentiation between the way they targeted adults and the way they targeted children. And actually Fadel also touched upon this point when he said children would be treated the same way. And we saw this when they went into detention. And in fact, there was no difference between the way that, especially teenage boys, because there were less girls being arrested, there was no difference in the torture that they received or the reason they were being tortured, which was basically to give names of people who were supporting the demonstrations. One thing that kind of links up to a grave violation, what grave violation against children is attacks on hospitals, but hospitals can be weaponized in other ways. And in 2012, in 2011, during the demonstrations, what would happen is that if you were injured during the demonstration, you couldn't go to a hospital, or it was very risky to go to a hospital to get medical care because the hospitals were controlled by the government. And so it was assumed that you supported the protests and you were running the risk of getting arrested. So this means that children who were sniped at or were beaten in the protests were not getting access to that medical care. Again, as Fadel has pointed out, those arrests, many of them have resulted in enforced disappearances and in the torture of children. Many of the children remain missing to this day. As we move to 2012, so let's say late 2011 to August 2012, when the Syrian government started using air power, we start seeing the patterns shifting because the FSA was created. This, of course, meant that we were moving towards an armed conflict. We start seeing the violence changes, so we start seeing more shelling, and we start seeing ground operations. So not just Syrian forces, and I think here it's important to distinguish that a lot of these ground operations, which were effectively going from house to house, looking for people who had participated in the demonstrations and were supporting the FSA. A lot of these ground operations were conducted by pro-government militias and not government forces themselves. What we see here is a combination of arrests, of pillaging, and sexual violence. And this is one of the moments, except for the small number of girls who had been arrested during the demonstrations and taken to prison, this is when we start seeing girls being targeted for sexual violence by these pro-government militias. Inevitably, this level of violence also means people start getting displaced, which means children have to live with their parents. I know Javier is going to touch upon the impact of this type of violence on children and education, so I will not go into it. So 2012, the violence escalates. A lot of people consider that it's February, others say July, that 2012, that we moved to an armed conflict. But more important than the legal qualification, what we see here, in the beginning, we started calling them blockades. We weren't calling them sieges yet. So as government forces were trying to gain control over a specific neighborhood or a specific town, they would cut off the main roads leading up that would reach those towns. And humanitarian aid was being denied. People were starting to go without water and sufficient food, which inevitably affected children. In parallel, there was heavy shelling going on. And children, because they are in residential areas, they were being affected. And this brings me to, I think is an important point, that one of the reasons, although we have instances in which children were deliberately targeted, the Dara boys are perhaps the most well-known example. Many of the violations committed against Syrian children is because the warring parties disregard the fact that they are present in a given location. So it's not, in my opinion, it's not so much let's go and kill these children or maim them or destroy the schools. It's just we will do whatever it takes to take control of that territory. and children are living there, and they will inevitably be affected, whether physically or by physically injuries or being killed or having to move. Late 2012, I thought this was quite interesting, and I confess I only researched it for this presentation. In late 2012, we also start seeing that armed opposition groups start using children. They start enlisting children who volunteer to work for them. And I say work for them because they initially were not fighters. They were couriers, and they were helping to provide medical aid to those injured. And then they become, some of them become fighters. And in fact, this is a pattern that we see in the armed groups before we start seeing it in the Syrian government. The Syrian government, it's only in 2013, so we're 2.5 years into the conflict, that the Syrian government starts conscripting children under 18. And this has, those who have worked on Syria are well aware of this phenomenon, which is this attempt to conscript both boys who reach the age of 18, but also those who don't reach them, means that boys are getting arrested at checkpoints, and that families, to avoid the conscription of their sons, start either moving inside of Syria, and many of them actually flee the country so that the boys avoid conscription. So then moving on to the 2013, 2017, this period that I said was marked by sieges. What we see here is, in a way, because the communities have been separated, they are no longer living together in the same city. People have moved across Syria along the lines of who controls which parts of the territory. What we see here is that those who move to areas who then become under siege, and those who are already living there. Again, there are instances, there are bombings of specific schools. There's, for example, the very famous bombing of the Haas school in Idlib, in which 27 children were killed. But mostly what we see is the use of indiscriminate attacks, and especially when the Syrian government forces and the Syrian Air Force conducts airstrikes, by and large, they're using munitions that are not accurate, that, and I quote an expert, give or take 100 meters. So there is the knowledge that if you are using this type of weapon in a encircled area where people cannot get away from, you know you are going to be killing and maiming children. Then there's allegations that armed groups were using hospitals and schools as military headquarters. People stop being able to go there, or they're afraid to go there, including children. We start seeing a lot of cases of malnutrition because humanitarian aid cannot go in. For me personally, because it was the first siege that I worked on, was Aleppo, and it will always stay with me, the testimony of women who spoke that they had given birth and they couldn't breastfeed their children because they weren't eating enough, so they wouldn't produce milk. So there are very indirect ways to make the civilian population bear the brunt, and everyone knows that in Syria, a large part of that population are children. So even if the perpetrators are not thinking we're going to target the children, they know that by choosing specific tactics, that's going to happen. Similarly, when armed groups were shelling people living in government-controlled areas, they're using weapons that are not precise, and often they would land on a house of a family and a grandmother. I remember an instance, for example, of a grandmother and two of her grandchildren, both girls, dying. So a lot of it does have to do with the type of weapons that are being used. There is perhaps just, I would just like, as a way to sum up, and others have worked on Syria more on Idlib since 2017 than I have, that this is a population that is now concentrated in a relatively small place, the Idlib has now more than double of the population that it did before the war. I'm sure Javier will speak about the lack of education. But I would just like to say, to conclude, and apologies, because I know everyone knows what are the 6 grave violations. Killing and maiming, we've seen it throughout since 2011. Use of child soldiers, we've seen it from the side of the government since 2013. And from the armed groups since 2012. Sexual violence against girls, we saw it particularly during 2011 and 2013, during those ground operations where girls were very vulnerable to being attacked. And then we had, of course, ISIL, particularly in the period 2014-2017. And as Fadel mentioned, abductions leading to either forced conscription or arrests going on almost since the beginning of the conflict. Here, just very quickly on abductions, I just want to point out that armed groups have used women and children as hostages with the specific purpose of exchanging them for the corpses of Syrian government soldiers. So this is a very particular pattern to armed groups. And then finally, the last 2 violations, the attacks on schools and hospitals and the denial of humanitarian aid. I think we saw it mostly during sieges, mostly by pro-government forces, as a way to force the population to surrender, and it was extremely successful. This was very brief. There were so many aspects I'd like to develop, but I hope it gives a flavor of what the answer could be to these 2 questions.
Nina, thank you very much indeed. And I know you had to cancel some commitments to accept SNHR's invite for today, but I'm really, really glad you did. Thanks again. Javier Perez-Salmeron, you have served as a child rights expert seconded by Justice Rapid Response to the DRC, to Colombia, to Bangladesh in relation to the Rohingya crisis, as well as for over 2 years with the Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic. And in that capacity, you interacted on a daily basis with victims and witnesses of child rights violations as the ones documented in the SNHR report, including children, their parents, their caregivers, teachers who have had their schools destroyed and their pupils killed, or female students who were deprived of their right to education by extremist groups. Is it even possible to convey or describe the impact that the conflict of these proportions and duration has had on generations of children or their communities and on the country as a whole? Fadel mentioned they did not touch upon this in their report. It would be really, really helpful to have your take. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentina, and thank you very much to our fellow colleagues today in the panel, and thank you to Fadel and SNHR team for the invitation to participate in this event. And I was very happy to see them again after so many months working together. As you said, I think it's quite difficult to summarize the impact that so many years and so many crimes and violations that have been committed by all parties to the conflict have affected children, boys and girls and adolescents. As you said, and as the SNHR report and Fadel reiterated before, there is a need to pay attention to the impact on the well-being of children that these 10 years of war have had. So allow me to just synthesize, maybe the impact that this conflict and these levels of violence have had in children in, let's say, a different approach, because there are so many things that have been already said and mentioned in the report and in other reports. So I will just try to see them from a different perspective, a different approach. And for me, we can elaborate on 3 main aspects. Now, one is the deep impact on the mental health and psychosocial well-being of children and not just children, but on the well-being of their caregivers, their parents, and the community as a whole. I think this impact goes beyond the children themselves. And as you said, I have been speaking with so many different people in Syria with different profiles, and this has come across all these interviews and conversations with them. No, there is a massive mental health crisis with a profound impact on the well-being of the children, and this is not just because of the exposure to direct, let's say, events that become a trauma to the person that is going through these events, but it is also related to the dripping effect of continuous exposure to direct and indirect ways of violence by the children themselves, but also through the connection with their caregivers, fathers, mothers, teachers, etc. So, and it relates to, for example, the sense of the lack of safety and security over the years. It is also related to the build-up of the continuous disruption of relationships and connections between the children themselves, their peers, and the children and their caregivers. It is also related to the changing roles, responsibilities, and identities that the boys and the girls have had to play over the years and over the different contexts that Lina has mentioned before. And I think it's also related to the disempowerment that all this exposure to violence has produced in the children themselves, bringing that sense of lack of hope and lack of meaning that the title of the report talks about. No, so I would say that this is one of the main for me impacts of all these crimes. No, that have been mentioned in the report through the MRM or the monitoring and reporting grave violations and other crimes that have been documented and reported by other mechanisms. So I just want to highlight that it is not just for children themselves, but it's also related to their caregivers and related to the different circles of support that the children need in order to develop mentally and physically. So that will be one. And related to this one, I would like to highlight also, and Lina has mentioned before that I will be speaking about education. I think education is one of the clear examples of one of the second impact that I would like to highlight today, which is the destruction of the protective environments that are needed for children in every society in order to develop themselves. And the educational system is one of the main ones. No, without a proper educational system and educational environment, there is children, boys and girls and adolescents have very difficulties to access that level of protection that they need. And in this sense, I'm not just talking about the attacks on the schools or the use of the schools for military purposes. It goes beyond. It goes to the system itself. No, it is about not just the buildings, but also the teachers and all the educational staff that are being targeted or harassed or kidnapped or detained, or that are subjected to any other kinds of violations from the different parties to the conflict. It relates also to the environment of the school and how the different parties to the conflict access to that environment or act in the frame of that environment. And I'm thinking about, for example, armed groups that are targeting the educational system in order to recruit, in order to force girls to early marriage, and so on. Another aspect that is related to a protected environment, like the school, is the purpose that it serves, and it serves to the purpose of creating and building the child, supporting the childhood, building a human being. And in that sense, it's very important, for example, what is happening in Syria in terms of the content of the content of the curriculum. You can see it how the educational system in Syria has been fragmented in pieces that are being recovered by the different parties to the conflict to rebuild from their 3, 4, or 5 different educational systems that are having different curriculums, different contents, and that in fact are being used for political gains. No? And also I'm talking about, for example, the negative impact that has this fragmentation of the educational system in terms of the recognition of the education certificates or the academic certificates that children get from these educational systems that later on are not recognized internally in the country and also internationally. And this is a barrier that is there with negative impact on the children, because they are pushed also to have or to take risks in order to risks for their lives and risks for their families in order to get those that quality education or those certificates. And I'm thinking about, for example, children that need to cross the lines, go through checkpoints, stay for days, long days in the other areas where they live, to separate from the families. They are not allowed to go with their parents. So there is a long list of negative consequences of this absence of these protection environments that may allow the child and the girls and the boys to develop themselves and to live their childhood. No? And this is the second one. And then the third one that is very much related to all the list of crimes, no, that we have been speaking about, is what I can say is the crisis of the child rights approach. You know, one of our colleagues, panelists, have mentioned this is a human rights crisis. If we take this for children, I think it's a child rights crisis. But I will go beyond that, and I will say that it is the way we read and the way we view the situation in Syria and the impact that it has in the children is related to consider the children again and give priority to consider the children again as rights holders. You know, they have the rights, and it's more than all this list of crimes. It's also about all the kind of violations that are related to these crimes, and they are also about those violations that are the ramifications and the linkages between these crimes and these violations. And in this case, for example, I can mention issues like the negative impact of lacking the birth certificates, for example, for some children that were born in certain regions of Syria at a certain point of time, and then currently they are not. The families are not able to register them in the civil registration registries. They are not having access to identity cards. Their affiliation is unknown, and this is leading to a scores of children in situations of statelessness. So this is something that is very linked to some of the crimes that we have been that we know, or we have been talking about, and this has serious consequences for children in the sense of accessing services. No, another example I can give in terms of the children as right holders is the situation of these vulnerable groups of children living with disabilities, or children that have been maimed during the armed conflict, and now they have to live with the amputation of limbs, and in that sense, their access to services compound with the situation of displacement, separation from the families, and continuous blockade in some regions is difficult in their access to some of the services. No.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Javier?
Yes.
I just need to give the floor to Diane so that we can keep a few minutes for the Q&As. So I just let you wrap up and give the floor to Diane. Thank you.
Yeah, just to end with a positive note. I'm on the group of not losing the hope for Syrian children, and it is based on the positive side of the three elements that I have mentioned. Now, if we work on supporting the well-being of the children, the psychosocial well-being of the children, if we work on supporting the reestablishing protective environments for children, and if we prioritize this approach of children as right holders, I think there is hope for Syrian children. So back to you, Valentina.
Thank you so very much, Javier. Thank you, and good to hear that. I mean, there is still hope. Professor Rahman, 10 years into the conflict, and again, speaking about hope, and after reading the report and listening to our discussion today, one can only imagine the sense of abandonment and hopelessness that children affected by armed conflict in Syria must be experiencing. So Fadel open saying there's still hope. Is there hope, and what remedies and avenues for accountability can international law offer to children in Syria?
Well, the positive note is that there are many avenues for accountability and efforts toward restorative justice. I am not going to speak to the International Criminal Court as an avenue. In fact, I'm forbidden to do so by a United States executive order that remains in place, notwithstanding the transition that occurred earlier this week. However, it is quite clear from everything that we've heard that conduct is occurring that constitutes both systematic violations of human rights in many, many different sectors, as well as, in fact, international crimes as articulated in statutes of multiple tribunals and recognized at customary international law. So the question is, how do you turn that fact into avenues for accountability? This report is itself an aspect of accountability. We should never lose sight of the fact that documentation of misdoing, publication of that documentation, cooperation with other groups, the various investigating mechanisms, etc., is itself a way of holding individuals accountable, not before a court of law, but before the court of public opinion, and that is not insignificant. And so I congratulate and thank SNHR for its efforts in that regard. There may be one day some sort of tribunal conferred with jurisdiction over this matter, in which case this kind of documentation would be very important. We always need to remember, however, that when we're speaking of international criminal tribunals, we have the extremely difficult obstacle of proving what we call attribution. It is often much easier to document the fact of crimes than to link them in the way that a criminal court requires to a particular individual's responsibility. And so even as we look perhaps to transnational prosecutions in countries, some of which are on this call, whose courts have already entertained or are engaging in criminal litigation arising out of this conflict, we need to remember that it is difficult at times to secure convictions in this area. That said, there are other avenues that can and should be explored. We've had a reference to the International Court of Justice. Were that to occur, it would be the effort by one or more countries in the world to hold responsible countries to account for this conduct through the notion of state responsibility. The other avenues that I'd like to mention very quickly, because I know that time is at issue, is to remember that every country in the world has a responsibility both to respect and ensure the rights of individuals in its country. Respect means it shouldn't harm them. Ensure means it should protect them against harm. And the documentation that we see suggests there have been both commissions, overt violations of the pledge to respect, as well as a profound failure to protect individuals from harm. Syria in particular belongs not only to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and two of its optional protocols, as mentioned in the report, but it also belongs to the Convention Against Discrimination Against Women, the Disabilities Convention, the Convention Against Torture, both of the international covenants, all of which have provisions that are implicated by what we've seen in this report, all of which have treaty bodies that require periodic reporting, some of which allow individual communications. So the short statement would be that we should look to all of those avenues to try to continue to raise consciousness about what's happening and to seek from those authoritative treaty bodies their articulation, their finding, confirming what we're seeing in reports like this. So I think if we see that concerted effort to do that, we can indeed end on a hopeful note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane, and really always important as human rights and international law practitioners to remember that there is indeed a legal and normative architecture, and perhaps, again, building on the different branches of international law, a way to accountability can eventually be found. So thanks for this important reminder. So we have now 11 minutes left for the Q&As. I see some questions here, but I think each of them would require really a long time to be addressed, and perhaps we can then follow up after the event. But perhaps picking up on what I'm seeing now on my screen, perhaps a broader question to Fadel, just to break the ice. And Fadel, your report includes a number of recommendations that are aimed at parties to the conflict, the Security Council, UN agencies, and the international community as a whole. So if you could pick the most urgent one, and someone is of course flagging the issue of children that are exposed to the bitter cold of winter in IDP camps. So if you could pick the most urgent recommendation and the one that you think may have the most concrete impact on the protection of children in Syria in the here and now, what would that be?
Thank you very much. I think that there is like different types of those violations, especially committed by Assad regime, like the extrajudicial killing, is widespread and systematic. Also the disappearance and the displacement, those amount to be crimes against humanity, and that need actually due to the failure of the UN Security Council. That need intervention from all the states who attached the Convention on the Right of Children to fulfill their obligations to hold the Syrian regime accountable, expose regime's crimes, criminal practices against Syrian children, and makes every possible effort to mitigate and stop them. Regarding the IDP and other type of exposed violation to the Syrian children, I think that it's required an appeal from all states to increase their fund to the IDP, mainly due to this awful circumstances which Syrian faced. And in this regard, we retreat our condemnation that due to the Russian veto, there is one cross-border being blocked, and that exposed more suffer to the IDP. Due to that, I think state need to take further steps to increase their support to the aid organization, to the local aid, and to the OCHA as well. So those mainly my recommendation.
Thank you very much, Fadel. And if I may, perhaps Javier and Lina, a question for both of you, and then perhaps one last question before wrapping up to Diane. But Javier and Lina, I know you've both worked extensively on this issue. How has the conflict impacted differently on boys and girls, and how can we all be more effective in addressing the gender consequences of the Syrian war? I'll give 2 minutes to each of you. I know it's difficult to condense such a topic in 2 minutes, but just your thoughts if you can. Thanks.
Perhaps I can start if that's all right, Javier. Yes. I will repeat a little bit some things that I've said. I mean, we know from the statistics, I don't like to call them statistics, from the number of cases documented, we do know that boys are more likely to be targeted for arrest. They're more likely to be detained. They're more likely to be used as in armed hostilities. The girls were, especially in the first few years, much more likely to be subjected to sexual violence. So even though a lot less girls than boys were arrested, the percentage of girls who would be subjected to sexual violence in detention was much, much higher than the percentage of boys, although some boys were subjected to sexual violence, especially rape without objects. If I look at it now, I think the concern, and Javier mentioned some of these points too, the concern now that we have with those who are outside of the country as refugees and those who are internally displaced is that lack of education is affecting them all, but it's more likely to be affecting girls. If there's any opportunity to go back to school, that opportunity is probably more likely to be given to boys and girls. And again, we know this from those who became refugees, were more likely to be married at an early age because the families perceive that as a form of protection somehow. So that's not a direct violation by the warring parties, but it's a consequence that could have been predicted. So I was trying to kind of go to 2011 and also to now, how it's impacting differently boys and girls. And of course, bearing in mind that some of those children are now young adults, and that brings a different perspective to how they're thinking and how they perceive the last 10 years.
Over to you, Javier.
Yeah, maybe add something that comes to my mind, for example, in the sense of in the crime of the recruitment of children, for example, related to some of the perpetrators, like the SDF, they are targeting also girls and boys, no, and they are the only group that is targeting girls, no, for this specific crime, no, whereas other groups are more targeting children, no, for the purposes of recruitment, no. I agree with the fact that in terms of the consequences of of the disruption of education and all these attacks on the educational system, girls are more likely to be asked and forced by the family to drop out and dedicate to and assume other roles and responsibilities. No, I will quickly highlight those two. Yes.
Thank you so much, Javier and Lina and Diane. One last question for you. I mean, this has been, we all know, a momentous week for the international community. None of us, of course, has a crystal ball, and I also know you are constrained in what you can say. But I was wondering whether you expect any changes in the approach to the issue of criminal accountability for human rights violations in Syria.
I think that events like these can help push stronger calls for criminal accountability. We should be heartened that there are so many evidence documenting mechanisms, both governmental and intergovernmental and non-governmental in place, because from a criminal law perspective, the evidence has to meet certain standards of reliability, and it is much easier for a prosecutor to work with dossiers that were compiled as the crimes were occurring than to, say, try to go back and reconstruct years later. So I think that those are all fortunate situations. I don't think my crystal ball is any clearer than anyone else's on whether and when we will find sufficient political consensus to form a tribunal or confer jurisdiction on an existing tribunal. One can, if I may borrow the title of the report, one can only hope.
Thank you so much, Diane. And I am afraid we have reached the end of our event, but I would really like to thank once more Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and all of our speakers for the rich discussion, Fadel Abdulghani and the SNHR team for their tireless efforts to document human rights and child rights violations in Syria, and all the participants really for tuning in and for their support to all those Syrian and international organizations and member states who seek to keep the plight of violations against children in Syria on the radar of the international community. Thank you very much to all of you, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.